And welcome back to Wake Up America Weekend. I'm Joe Pinion. Well, President Biden's administration continues to shirk any and all responsibility from their botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. And with a new defense spending bill just passed, it appears the spotlight has once again shifted away from them taking any accountability at all. Here to discuss how these changes are affecting our armed forces and our standing on the global stage, retired Air Force General and United States Deputy Military Representative to NATO, Blaine Holt. Always good to see you, my friend. Let's talk a little bit about what this defense bill means. Again, putting all of this in context, $2 trillion of failed nation building, collapsing in 11 days in Afghanistan, that vacuum being filled now by China at that airport in Kabul, $85 billion of military hardware left behind. How do we actually make sense of this nonsense?
Well, it's good to see you too, Joe. But on the topic, from the standpoint of the Defense Authorization Act, the chore of shoring up the nation's defense is much, much harder than it was and more complex than it was before this Afghanistan debacle. 20 years of war and trillions of dollars, and we just leave immediately, leaving our allies and our partners kind of in the breach. And now we see a budget that's coming on, and we have to ask serious questions about what we're doing with the money. And while these are giant numbers, we need to see mechanisms that get into the auditing and the efficiency spent in these dollars, because now we're going to see threats around the world that are already emerging, whether it's China bearing down on Taiwan and her neighbors, and looking at what Putin's new designs are in Europe, and especially with regards to Ukraine.
Well, specifically to that point, the question has to be asked, are we building for yesterday, or are we preparing for tomorrow? You look at the fact that the Chinese Navy has surpassed the U.S. Navy in size for the first time ever. You look at the fact that, to your point, you have China basically tightening their grip on Taiwan, all the implications there. Are we preparing for 21st century warfare, particularly when you look at Russia hacking our fuel supply, hacking our beef supply, the SolarWinds hack that we know from China, compromise everything from your local business to the Pentagon. All of these things lead us to believe the nature of warfare is changing, and our approach to national security has to change along with it.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because in the one sense, in the Defense Authorization Act, modernization, we certainly have edges in technology. We're losing our giant advantage, but we are definitely committed to weapons that are over the horizon and forward-looking. The problem is what you just nailed, which is warfare is now executed in every domain and on every single level. I mean, there's a concept that we study in my company that's called adversarial logistics, where your opponent can go buy out companies in a fourth-tier supply chain to eradicate your ability to produce a fighter. So there are so many levels of warfare, and then we have to make our defense personnel ready for the new challenges of understanding economics and the economics behind warfare, because that's what ultimately makes heads of state make their decisions.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the human component of all of this. We've seen so many members of our armed forces now having to deal with these federal vaccine mandates, now learning that Marines now could potentially find themselves out of a job as a result of these mandates. Talk to us a little bit about, number one, the efficacy of that, but then two, the impact that has on our readiness, because it's not as if you can just send one Marine home and another one steps up. We spend millions of dollars making sure that every single one of those people that serve this nation bravely are the best of the best. And that type of institutional drain can have dire consequences for keeping this nation safe.
Absolutely. In my opinion, this is breaking faith with the force. This is breaking faith with people who served under a certain set of rules and now are finding themselves shifting to another. And it's absolutely vacuous to say, oh, well, I mean, there's a lot of vaccine mandates that have always been on the books. This is a vaccine like no other, and it has not gone through the trials that others have, and it is still sitting on an emergency use authority. And yet we bear down on those who have served in combat to say, you are now outside of the regulations of the force, And there's a stigma. And so the National Defense Authorization Act allows for discharge under a general discharge under honorable conditions. But there's peril in that. You have a stigma in the employment workforce outside. And then there's those who are still serving on active duty who feel that they had no choice and they were coerced. And let's not forget that 0 religious exemptions were granted. And that's why we see these 7 major lawsuits cropping up from all over to get at this. And again, this is not how you have a cohesive, ready-to-go fighting force by taping the nation's #1 controversial issue to the force.
Well, I think to that point, it seems as if there is a moral side of this that we don't talk about. Individuals who raise their hand to be dropped into war zones around the globe without having any idea what they're going to be exposed to. People who stood on the front lines in the midst of COVID when we did not have a vaccine, willing to again risk their life for this country. Yet here we are finding ourselves with so many of those people, to your point, potentially facing the stigma of not getting the honorable discharge that many of them have earned and paid for with their sacrifice. General Blaine Holt, as always, my friend, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. And Happy New Year. We'll talk to you again.
Happy New Year. Thanks
All
for
right.
having me.
Much more to come after the break.